try to be brief.
Even Dr. Cotton, even in his final report, says that Mr. Bourgoin presented with organized comments about his mental stressors and the symptoms which he experienced, including anxiety, eventually so severe that it produced distortions in his thought. His reports are consistent with delusional thoughts. Diminished capacity, as you will hear, is if you need to determine beyond a reasonable doubt whether or not Mr. Bourgoin was suffering from a mental condition which prevented him from forming the required mental state for second-degree murder. So even Dr. Cotton, in his last iteration of what he thought was going on, after he changed his report, came to the conclusion that he was suffering from symptoms so severe that it produced distortions in his thought. The state put up graphics and digital with regard to Friday night out in the field. He didn't explain to you why on earth Mr. Bourgoin was doing that, why on earth he was out there. What about calling this number? The only inference is that he found that number on that sign when he was out there by the river in the cornfield, and he called the sign and he called the number because he was getting communications and he was trying to communicate with people and with things. There's no other explanation. There's no other reason we would find that number out by that river. There just isn't. And the state can't explain that. If they can't explain to you what was going on Friday night, they can't explain to you what was going on Saturday night. We went through today with Dr. Cotton the comments by Asima Kosovic. We went through today that she didn't take him seriously, that this was something, and even Dr. Cotton says, this is what people say. And she confirmed in that very same interview where Ms. George is cherry-picking the statements that are bad for Mr. Bourgoin, forgetting that she says in that very same interview, I didn't take him seriously, he was joking, we were laughing by the end of it. The Facebook conversation, which again, Ms. George put up there and said, hey, he's reaching out to somebody. Trooper Crick went through, and if you were following that testimony, she went through and said it's possible that it was somebody communicating with Mr. Bourgoin first, somebody commenting upon a post, and that was the first communication, and what we see are things that happened after that. In fact, there was, 3 minutes prior to that, there was something that was going on his Facebook page with Mr. Whitney. Dr. Kapoor, Dr. Rosemarin saw the videos that you just saw from the hospital. Ms. George says, you look at that and you decide whether this is consistent with somebody who was psychotic. I would suggest that Dr. Rosemarin and Dr. Kapoor may be in a better position to analyze that video and determine whether or not it's consistent with somebody they believe was falling into a psychotic state. They reviewed them and they looked at them. They looked at all the evidence that the state is pointing to. And not Ms. George analyzing it, but Dr. Kapoor and Dr. Rosemarin. Dr. Kapoor, well, the state says, well, what about Dr. Rosemarin? Did he seem like somebody that didn't have a bias? Well, just look at Dr. Kapoor. Look at her. Did she see somebody that was biased? Did she look like she was trying to just start with the presumption that he's insane and go from there? She did exactly the opposite. She came into this case highly skeptical. she tried all she could to find for the state. She went back to Mr. Bourgoin again and again. She took anything the state could give them. She took all the digital evidence. She looked at all of these statements that Ms. George are saying are bad for Mr. Bourgoin. She knew all about them. She looked at every single one of them, read every single one of them, talked to Mr. Bourgoin about them, and came to the conclusion that he was insane at the time of the offense. Mr. Bourgoin had a phone. We know he was using his phone. We know he was using it a lot. We have no idea what he was doing on his phone, no data to support that. We've got incomplete data about what Mr. Bourgoin, how much Mr. Bourgoin was searching, what he was searching. He's searching on search engines, and we don't know what's behind that. What is going on, the searches, once he gets past kind of the first page of the search engine. He certainly is under stress. It is the stress that both Dr. Kapoor and Dr. Rosemarin say are the catalyst to the psychosis. That he's got this underlying condition that makes him more susceptible to psychosis when stressed, and he has that stress. The lunch with Mr. Kosovic, where Mr. Kosovic talked about McDonald's, Mr. Kosovic talked about Todd Taylor. Who does Mr. Bourgoin think is in on it by this point? In on it, maybe in a good way, maybe on a bad way. And now he's telling me to make these calls, go to these places. And he shows up at McDonald's, and there's a sign that says, text apply. And yeah, there wasn't any evidence to that. There wasn't any, there's the text, and it's applied. It's an inference. There is an inference that that is what happened. Just like the phone call down at the river, down by the field, to New England Organics. There's certainly no evidence of that. Mr. Bourgoin never, ever talked about it. He never mentioned it once. Wouldn't he have said if he's somehow, faking some type of psychosis? I called this number, random number, down by the field. You should go get it. That would help prove my case. He's got no memory of it. We just figured it out. And after we figured it out, we went and looked for the evidence, and there it was. The farmer didn't call us and say, I have these signs there, and I have the numbers. We thought from the perspective of Mr. Bourgoin, and we said, the only way he's calling that number is if he saw it some way out in the field. We went down there, and there it was. The state doesn't talk about Friday night at all. Mr. Ray provides evidence to you of the drives on Friday, the erratic driving, he called it, on Friday. There's the drive to Heinsberg after work towards Heinsberg, gets to St. George. There's the other erratic driving on Friday where he is kind of around Essex and then goes down a road, makes an abrupt turn and comes back. And then there's the evidence that puts him in the field on Friday night. And it wasn't in this area that they're talking about. He said, go down the azimuth. That's where I think Mr. Bourgoin was when he got rid of his phone, when his phone stopped. And he says he smashed his phone. Did Mr. Bourgoin tells this story first to Ms. Kiley in November 2016. Does he have any sense that there's going to be forensic evidence that's going to support that? I submit to you, Mr. Ray, who was working with the state police, was doing the cell tower investigation to prove Mr. Bourgoin was never down by that river. He was never there. He said he did this big thing on Friday night. Let's look at his cell tower records, and it'll show you he was nowhere near there. Well, it showed just the opposite. The evidence showed, when the state did their investigation, the evidence showed that what Mr. Bourgoin said happened, happened. It's not going to show what's going on in his mind. There's no way for that to happen. But it showed he was down by that river. He was psychotic. He was calling numbers. He had no business calling, and the only reason he would call them was because he had some strange idea that he needed to communicate with them. Doctors Rosemarin and Dr. Kapoor looked at all of the evidence. I submit Dr. Kapoor did an exhaustive research and critical analysis of this in an attempt to actually find Mr. Bourgoin sane at the time. And she couldn't. She just simply couldn't. And she told you that on initial review, this sounded not plausible. But that through her training, experience, her clinical work, her working with people and examining them, that what went on here and what he said was consistent with somebody who became psychotic. And that she then looked at the verifying information and said that while there were some inconsistencies, it seemed to verify what he said. And while this might not look like it's plausible to an untrained eye, that in her opinion, shared by Dr. Rosemarin, in their trained eye, that he was insane at the time. I think if decisions are to be made about important things, and there's medical experts who can assist you in that. They have the talent, they have the expertise, and their judgment should be trusted. It should be critiqued, but it should be trusted. And they both come to this conclusion. Dr. Cotton's, quite frankly, his opinions with regard to this case are hard to understand. But all three say something was going on with Mr. Bourgoin, and I would submit that he was insane at the time of the offense. Thank you.
Can I see counsel for the bench? So, members of the jury, my plans often go awry. And I had absolutely hoped and planned to get the case to you a little bit earlier than now. As the attorneys on both sides have alluded to, the instructions in this case are quite complicated. We've spent a lot of time on them. You will have those instructions in hand when I give it to you. But in view of the huge amount of work that the attorneys have done in this case, I can't in good conscience give this to you at the end of a long day when you're exhausted. Plus, I'm a huge believer in the neuroscience that we make our best decisions after we've had a good night's sleep. So what I'm going to do is to excuse you for the evening. Is it possible for you folks to be back here at 8:30 tomorrow morning? Does anyone have an issue with 8:30? Okay, so if we kept 8:45, does that still work for you?
Yeah.
All right. So I am completely all set on this end. So if you can all plan to be back here at 8:45, then what the plan would be tomorrow is I will instruct you on the law. You will have the case tomorrow morning first thing, and then you can begin your deliberations without any feeling or pressure of a timeline or anything else like that in terms of making the decisions. So remember, we still don't know who the alternates are until tomorrow, so please come prepared to occupy yourself if you're selected as the alternates, and I'll give you more instructions on that in the morning. I do want to continue to thank you. You've been amazingly patient with us, especially when we've had glitches that have taken a little bit of time to take care of. So your attention and patience with us is incredibly appreciated. I'm going to continue to please. We're almost there. So please avoid any news media accounts, any conversations with anyone, any temptation to research anything on the internet. We'll see you here first thing tomorrow morning. I'll give you the instructions on the law, and the case will be yours tomorrow morning. So thank you again.
All right.